Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is Episode 5. In the previous episode, we mentioned that one of the easiest ways to differentiate between history and historicity is to think of history as the cooked sausage and historicity as the sausage factory. We also mentioned that health inspectors were very concerned with health issues and all that can go wrong in the various areas and stages of the sausage making process. Consumers, of course, are assuming that the sausage they purchase in the store has been inspected and certified and is safe to eat, as no one wants to eat contaminated meat. And so we see that the question of what goes on inside the sausage factory is of major concern to both health inspectors and consumers alike. Likewise, consumers of historical works should also be concerned with what goes on behind the scenes and with all that is involved and with all that can go wrong in the academic process of historical research, documentation, sourcing of materials, reassessing those materials, and narrating, as well as publishing a particular historical work. The point is, a published historical work is the equivalent of cooked sausage, and so it is important to be at least a little aware of what goes on inside the sausage factory. In this episode, then, we will do precisely that. We will go inside the sausage factory of historicity and the somewhat messy sausage-making process of published historical works. In this somewhat messy sausage-making process of historical works, there are at least three major areas of concern that we would like every lover of historical works to be aware of whenever purchasing, reading, and evaluating an historical work. These three major areas of concern are as follows. 1. The decisive and pivotal role of historians. 2. The picturesque nature of historical narratives. And 3. The 4 R's of historical authenticity. Just as in a sausage factory, a lot can go wrong in any one of these three major areas of concern, and which could easily call into question the historical authenticity of this or that historical work. And therefore there should always be a buyer beware mentality on the part of the consumer whenever one settles down to read and enjoy a published historical work. We will begin then with the historians themselves, that is, with the decisive and pivotal role of historians. The credibility of the historian is of crucial importance when evaluating any historical work. Perhaps the best way to zero in on this credibility issue is to take into consideration the 3 traits of great historians, each of which adds to the credibility of the historian and his or her historical work. The first trait are the historian's skills of fact-finding, that is, in identifying, categorizing, and prioritizing historical data points across the often shifting historical landscape being studied. This, then, leads us to the second trait of great historians, for at a certain point in this historical research, the historian will arrive at the point wherein the historical authenticity of an historical work begins to depend more and more upon the morality of truth-telling. If the historian has a hidden agenda or an axe to grind, then the entire historical landscape becomes skewed and tainted. In other words, the skills of fact-finding will be of little value if the historian lacks the morality of truth-telling and rewrites history to lend support to his or her own private, social, religious, political, or even financial agenda. And so we see that the skills of fact-finding must be coupled with the morality of truth-telling if we are to have any hope of achieving historical authenticity. Finally, we have the third trait of great historians, and that is the artistry of storytelling. This third trait is equally important, as it is the artistry of the historical narrative that allows the historian to present the story or historical portrait in a captivating, instructive, colorful, and inspiring way, or, if he or she lacks this third trait, to make a mess of the whole project. You can see then that there are three distinct ways in which an historian can fail. The historian may lack the skills of fact-finding, the morality of truth-telling, or the artistry of storytelling, or any combination thereof. For example, let's take four historians, H1 through H4. The first historian has the potential to become a great historian because he or she scores high on all three traits of a great historian. Historian 2, however, scores high on the first two traits, but lacks the third trait, or the artistry of storytelling. This becomes problematic in the sense that he or she is incapable of painting an historical portrait or narrative that is capable of capturing the interest or imagination of anyone. However, Historian 2 may be in luck if he or she can collaborate on a project with Historian 3, who lacks the skills of fact-finding but scores high on the morality of truth-telling and the artistry of storytelling. Together then they may achieve a greatness that neither one of them by themselves could ever have achieved. Most problematic, however, is Historian 4, who scores high on the skills of fact-finding and high on the artistry of storytelling, but lacks the morality of truth-telling. This combination of traits is particularly dangerous and is something that can strike at the integrity or core of an historian or an entire historical department, and especially if historical authenticity plays second fiddle to unscrupulous and nefarious academic or personal agendas. There are, however, other ways of going wrong that manifest themselves in less nefarious ways, and which are common to most historical works, however neutral or impartial they may claim to be. One way of going wrong is this common tendency among mankind in general, and in this case of historians, of making a mountain out of a molehill, and all in an attempt to embellish or highlight a particular historical event or narrative. Another way of going wrong is this equally common tendency among mankind in general, including historians, to do just the opposite, that is, of making a molehill out of a mountain, and all in an attempt to downplay or gloss over a particular historical event or narrative. These two common tendencies among mankind, as well as among historians, find their way into almost every historical work and manifest themselves the moment an historian makes the decision to limit his or her historical research to this or that particular historical event or character, and to include or exclude this or that historical document, insight, or related material. These types of decisions, to include this or exclude that, are going on all the time in the sausage-making process. And so we ought to be aware of these tendencies of inclusion and exclusion, and be on the alert to the fact that the whole story or the full story is never really ever told, but only an approximation thereof. In any event, and in the name of fairness, let us give you one example of each of these two tendencies within the church and among church historians and apologists. That is, in making mountains out of molehills or molehills out of mountains. Beginning first with the reported and beloved miracle of the seagulls, and then turning to the second tendency with the reported and now infamous Mountain Meadows massacre. Remember, however, that this twofold tendency of mankind in general, and in this case of historians, for making mountains out of molehills or molehills out of mountains, is a fault or shortcoming of every historian and of every historical work, whether from within or without the church. In other words, we could have picked on any historical work or religious institution to make the same point. Another way of differentiating history from historicity is to think in terms of history as the latest attempt on the part of an historian to document a particular event, character, or historical period and declare what happened, ending with an exclamation mark, and to think of historicity in terms of what really happened, ending with a question mark, with the emphasis on the ongoing quest for historical authenticity. The point is that while history books proclaim what happened, with an often overconfident sense of finality in its historical narrative, historicity pushes back with its ongoing quest for historical authenticity by continually asking the probing question as to what really happened. With this distinction in mind, let us now consider this reported and beloved account of the miracle of the seagulls, and as an example of this tendency among mankind and historians of often making a mountain out of a molehill. Is the miracle of the seagulls a likely story? And if so, at the end of the day, is it the most likely story? Well, this is where historical research steps in and attempts to answer the question as to whether this proclaimed historical event was fact, legend, or myth. Historians discovered, through historical research, a more likely story than what has been reported and promulgated as the miracle of the seagulls. That is, that the damage to the crops in 1848 were due to 3 factors and not just one: frost, crickets, and drought. Furthermore, they discovered in these historical records that while church leaders of the time mentioned the frost, crickets, and drought, they did not make any mention of seagulls at all in their official summary of the first few years of the pioneers living in Salt Lake Valley. In other words, no one considered the action of the seagulls to be of a miraculous nature at the time. In fact, the gulls were reported to have returned to feast on the crickets for years afterwards, and presumably for years before as well. Not only do seagulls feast on insects as part of their regular diet, but we have also come to discover that the regurgitating of the crickets was and is a natural recurrence and not an unusual occurrence at all. Nonetheless, it is an historical fact that the crickets were a problem in 1948, and the seagulls did show up as usual, but not in the miraculous manner as many believe today, making this miracle of the seagulls more of a legend than an historical fact. And yet this miraculous view of things captivated the minds and hearts of the saints in Utah and achieved such legendary status that in 1955 the California seagull was named the state bird. In any event, through historical research, a more likely story has emerged than what has generally been believed to be the case, and that this particular historical research into the miracle of the seagulls is in perfect alignment with historicity's ongoing quest to present not just a more likely story, but the most likely story at any given time or place. The point, of course, in this first exercise is to simply make us all aware of this very human tendency to not only make mountains out of molehills in our own personal lives, and in our effort to highlight or immortalize a meaningful event or spiritual experience, but to alert us to the fact that historians are humans as well, and that they too are not at all immune from advancing a particular historical narrative by making a mountain out of what was only a molehill. Let us now shift to the opposite human tendency on the part of governments, institutions, historians, and individuals of making a molehill out of a mountain, and all in an ill-advised attempt to downplay or gloss over a particular historical event or incriminating historical narrative. Perhaps the best example of this in church history is to refer to the tragic and profoundly regrettable Mountain Meadows Massacre, which took place in southern Utah in September of 1857. Again, take notice of this distinction between history as an historian's account of what happened, with an exclamation mark at the end, and historicity as an academic discipline pushing back by continually asking the probing questions as to what really happened, with a question mark at the end. For example, in earlier accounts of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, we clearly have an attempt on the powers that be to make a molehill out of what was clearly a mountain of trouble for all those implicated. And yet, through historical research, we have clearly arrived in our day at a far more likely story, along with the shifting of the narrative, responsibility, and blame for the massacre away from a few southern Paiute Indians to the real culprits, the local church leaders and pioneer settlers. For those unfamiliar with this event, I quote from Wikipedia: "The Mountain Meadows Massacre was a series of attacks which resulted in the mass murder of 120 members of the Baker Fancher immigrant wagon train. The massacre occurred September 7th through the 11th, 1857, at Mountain Meadows in southern Utah, and was perpetrated by Mormon settlers belonging to the Utah Territorial Militia, together with some Southern Paiute Native Americans." Unquote. The question of involvement on the part of church leaders in this massacre, from Brigham Young on down to local church leaders, is still in dispute to this day. However, and I take this from the official church newsroom, and I quote, "In an effort to bring to light the details of the event, Latter-day Saint leaders opened the church's archives to the authors of the 2007 book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows." Speaking at the 150th anniversary of the massacre on the 11th of September 2007, President Henry B. Eyring said, "Although no event in history can fully be known, the work of these three authors has enabled us to know more than we ever have known about this unspeakable episode. The truth, as we have come to know it, saddens us deeply. We express profound regret for the massacre carried out in this valley 150 years ago today, and for the undue and untold suffering experienced by the victims then and by their relatives to the present time." The point, of course, in this second exercise is not to focus in on the Mountain Meadows massacre and a blight on church history, but to once again alert us all to this very human tendency among governments, institutions, and individuals, including historians, to make a molehill out of a mountain in an attempt to downplay or gloss over a particular historical event or incriminating narrative, such as was shown here with the Mountain Meadows massacre. We have then these two examples from church history, with the miracle of the seagulls as an example of the human tendency to make a mountain out of a molehill whenever desired, and the Mountain Meadows massacre as an example of this equally human tendency to make a molehill out of a mountain whenever desired. Again, historians are human as well, and are just as susceptible to these two tendencies as any other individual. The point is that we should always be on the lookout for either of these two tendencies when reading or evaluating the historical authenticity of an historical work. Now, if we circle back to the beginning of this episode, wherein we emphasize the credibility of historians as based on the three traits of great historians, we can see how the skills of fact-finding, the morality of truth-telling, and the artistry of storytelling all come into play with these two human tendencies to make mountains out of molehills and molehills out of mountains. Notice also the central position of the morality of truth-telling, which would not allow us to make mountains out of molehills or molehills out of mountains if the historical facts speak otherwise. In other words, without the morality of truth-telling, neither the skills of fact-finding nor the artistry of storytelling will be of any value to us, and in fact will make us all worse off, as we are led by this or that historical work to believe in falsehoods as historical facts and propaganda as historical truth. Let's turn now to yet another example of the decisive and pivotal role of historians in shaping this or that historical narrative by putting their thumb on what I am calling the historical authenticity scale and tipping it out of balance. Everyone expects an historical narrative to be fair and balanced, and for any historian to put his or her thumb on the scale in order to tip the historical narrative in this or that direction and away from what would otherwise be a far more authentic historical account is a major breach of what we have previously referred to as the morality of truth-telling. Again, historicity is all about historical authenticity, and as such, it is dependent upon historians approaching their work in an unbiased, impartial, neutral, objective, authentic, two-sided endeavor to approximate the full story as closely as possible. Mormon historicity has been accused of presenting church members and the general public with a one-sided faith-promoting historical narrative. In other words, church historians have been accused of putting their thumb on the historical authenticity scale and tipping it in an apologetic or positive manner. Post-Mormon historicity, however, has tried to lay claim to all the virtues of historicity as an academic discipline. That is, that unlike Mormon historicity, post-Mormon historicity claims to be unbiased, impartial, neutral, objective, and so forth, when it clearly is not. In fact, post-Mormon historicity is just as one-sided as is Mormon historicity, only in this case, their tipping of the scales is in a faith-pouncing rather than a faith-promoting direction, resulting in an antagonistic and negative tipping of the scales. The fact of the matter is that both Mormon and post-Mormon historicity have been caught up in this tipping of the historical authenticity scales in this or that direction, and the degree to which they have engaged in this tipping or slanting of the historical narrative is the degree to which historical authenticity suffers, and the complete or full story is either lost or left untold. The more general point is that every historical work engages in this tipping of the scales to one degree or another, as it is simply part of the behind-the-scenes sausage-making process, where it is all but impossible to get all the contaminants out of the finished product. Claims by post-Mormons that post-Mormon historicity is unbiased, impartial, neutral, objective, and so forth simply is not true. And so before we end this episode, I would like to give you a few examples of how this tipping of the scales works in what amounts to very artful, crafty, and subtle ways that often go unnoticed. The first example I would like to refer to is the treatment of Joseph Smith's schooling and early education as it relates to the complexity of the Book of Mormon. Mormon historicity refers to Joseph Smith as an unschooled, unassuming farm boy, making the complexity of the Book of Mormon all the more inexplicable and miraculous. To counter this argument, post-Mormon historicity refers to Joseph Smith not as an unschooled farm boy, but as a brilliant, creative genius, making the complexity of the Book of Mormon far more explicable, even though it be somewhat ingenious. Notice in both instances, however, that tipping of the historical authenticity scales in one direction or another to support one's historical narrative. First, we have Mormon historicity downplaying Joseph Smith's schooling by limiting it to what amounted to a third-grade education in his day. This downplaying of Joseph Smith's education plays up the inexplicable and miraculous nature of the Book of Mormon, particularly given its complex nature, which no unschooled farm boy could have possibly come up with. Again, to counter this historical narrative, post-Mormon historicity tips the scales in the opposite direction. That is, rather than playing down Joseph Smith's education, it plays up Joseph's innate intelligence, referring to his creative brilliance as highly original and imaginative, even praising Joseph as possessing an audacious and original mind. Notice the strategy here, that by playing up Joseph Smith's innate brilliance, post-Mormonism is able to play down the inexplicable and miraculous arguments surrounding the complexity of the Book of Mormon as being something natural and explicable, given Joseph's innate brilliance and ingenious imagination. What is interesting to note is that while post-Mormon historicity is eager to make a brilliant and creative genius out of Joseph Smith, and all in order to give a secular and natural explanation for the complexity of the Book of Mormon, as well as to advance their post-Mormon historical narrative, they are not so generous when it comes to the innate intelligence and the so-called 19th century mindset of the various witnesses to the Book of Mormon, who, according to their historical narrative, were evidently living in two worlds, with the supernatural realm having primacy over the natural. And so we see post-Mormon historicity treating the intelligence of the various witnesses to the Book of Mormon far differently than they did Joseph Smith, for they are treated more like backward and superstitious country bumpkins who were easily spooked, easily manipulated, and easily deceived by anyone with a creative and manipulative imagination such as they had just previously built Joseph Smith up to be. Notice again the purposeful tipping of the historical authenticity scales in the direction of a 19th century mindset of treasure hunting, folklore, and a supernatural worldview. For by playing down the innate intelligence and credibility of the Book of Mormon witnesses, Postmormonism is able to simultaneously play down the credibility of their personal testimony as to the authenticity of the Book of Mormon and the actual existence of tangible golden plates. Who, after all, is going to be naive enough to believe the testimony of a bunch of superstitious country bumpkins who supposedly spent most of their working days digging for hidden treasures and casting magical spells to ward off evil demons or spirit guardians who were put in charge of safeguarding those ever-shifting and elusive magical treasures? To see how this tipping of the scales works in real time, consider these words of Grant H. Palmer, taken from Chapter 6 of his historical work, An Insider's View of Mormon Origins. This chapter is entitled, Witnesses to the Golden Plates. He writes, and I quote, "This chapter seeks to understand the 19th century magical mindset, the shared magical perspective of these men, as a key to understanding their affirmations of seeing and handling the golden plates. The 8 witnesses' formal statement, probably dictated by Joseph Smith, appeared in the 1830 Book of Mormon. If the 3 witnesses and others inspected the plates in a vision, perhaps the 8 did also. I handled those plates," testified John Whitmer. "There were fine engravings on both sides. They were shown to me by a supernatural power." This added detail of how he saw indicates that the 8 probably did not observe or feel the actual artifact, just as Harris had testified. Both the Harris and Whitmer statements lead me to believe that the 8, like the 3, saw and scrutinized the plates in a mind vision. And yet, today, we see the witnesses as empirical, rational 21st century men instead of the 19th century men they were. We have ignored the peculiarities of their worldview, and by so doing, we misunderstand their experiences. Over time, we have reinterpreted their testimony so that it appears to be a rational, impressive, and unique story in the history of religion." Unquote. Notice that this tipping of the scales towards downplaying the credibility of the witnesses in order to simultaneously downplay the credibility of their testimony was loaded with numerous historical conjectures, with qualifiers such as probably, perhaps, leads me to believe, and so forth, all of which are part and parcel of the sausage-making process that makes up post-Mormon historicity and their claims to historical authenticity. With all these conjectures, already mentioned in the previous quotation, consider now this same author's supposedly unbiased, impartial, neutral, and objective account on how he believed the Book of Mormon came to be. He writes, and I quote, "The following is a plausible scenario for how the Book of Mormon came to be. Perhaps the outline of a book began to form sometime before Martin Harris became his scribe in April 1828. He had already experimented with seer stones, and, perhaps, he thought that through greater faith and concentration, God would open to his mind a vision of the secrets of the artifacts being discovered in upstate New York. The dictation proceeded, and later Martin lost the first 116 pages of transcription in mid-1828. This may have been fortuitous. An apprenticeship had been served, and the vision that was unfolding in Joseph's mind may have become more clear. The dictation probably progressed haltingly at first, perhaps as a kind of stream of consciousness narrative. Before Oliver Cowdery became his scribe in April 1829, the prophet had had 9 months to ponder the details of the plots and subplots and to flesh out the timeline. He thus had 3 years to develop, write, and refine the book, 6 years from the time he told his family about the project." Unquote. Notice again the number of conjectures in this supposedly unbiased, impartial, and objective account of how the Book of Mormon came to be. The author uses such words as plausible once, may have been and may have become once each, probably once, and perhaps 3 times, for a total of at least 7 conjectures within a single summary of what is supposed to be an objective historical account representing the definitive story of how the Book of Mormon came to be. And yet, when it comes to documenting church history, Postmormonism portrays its own historical works as the standard bearer of historical authenticity, meaning that they, and they alone, are presenting to the world not only the complete and true life story of Joseph Smith and the church's early origins, but that unlike Mormon historicity, they claim to do so in this unbiased, impartial, and objective manner. In any event, the pretentious and presumptuous nature of post-Mormon historicity is staggering given the inordinate number of its conjectures, as well as its blatant and continuous tipping of the authenticity scales in order to support their own one-sided, faith-pouncing historical narrative. Hopefully you are now beginning to gain a far better understanding of historicity as an academic discipline, and as to what goes on inside the sausage factory and behind the scenes when historians set out to write and publish an historical work under the guise of historical authenticity. For regardless of how great an historical work may be proclaimed to be, it is still cooked sausage coming out of a sausage factory, and should always be viewed as such. What troubles us most is that post-Mormon historicity, or cooked sausage, is not being portrayed as cooked sausage at all, but as the most definitive history of the church to date. And this despite the fact that post-Mormon historicity, as we have just shown, is itself loaded with numerous historical conjectures, with qualifiers such as probably, perhaps, leads me to believe, and so forth. And yet it is this post-Mormon historicity, or cooked sausage, that is being used to red pill Latter-day Saints into believing that their own understanding of church history is not only deficient, but mistaken, and all an attempt on the part of post-Mormons to create the cognitive dissonance needed to incite a faith crisis and to lead one member after another out of the church. The point is, were Latter-day Saints more familiar with historicity as an academic discipline and this sausage-making process, they would not be so susceptible to this notion that post-Mormonism is, somehow, the standard bearer of historical authenticity when it comes to the early life of Joseph Smith and to the origins of the church, when they clearly are not. This ends our discussion of the decisive and pivotal role of historians. In the next episode, we will discuss the remaining 2 major areas of concern in this sausage-making process, and which we would like every lover of historical works to be aware of whenever purchasing, reading, and evaluating an historical work. These 2 remaining major areas of concern are as follows: the picturesque nature of historical narratives and the 4 R's of historical authenticity. Once again, let us put a plug in for our course on eternalism by encouraging you to visit our website at christianeternalism.org. Elder John A. Witzel wrote, "Back of the revelations of the greatness of the prophet's knowledge that come to all who enter upon such a discussion stands the eminent fact that Mormon philosophy is plain, simple, and easily understood. There is no need and no room for mystery in the teachings of Joseph the prophet. Similarly, the philosophy of men, based upon nature, is essentially simple and easily understood." Elsewhere, Elder Witzel writes, "We concern ourselves only with that which is clear and understandable." We mention this because the attempt of post-Mormon historians to wipe out all the advances of the Enlightenment in Joseph Smith's day and to replace it with a so-called 19th century supernatural worldview is not an attempt on their part to understand the life of Joseph Smith or the early origins of the church, but to disparage Joseph Smith as much as possible, while coloring the entire Latter-day Restoration with mysticism, clairvoyance, supernaturalism, spooks, charlatans, and spiritual darkness, and all an attempt to move Mormon historicity as far away as possible from that which is clear and understandable.